Welcome to Christian Da'wah. Today we're going to be talking about the divinity of the Qur'an. I found a video on YouTube called Someone Made a Surah Like the Qur'an, Now What? And it's by Arabic 101. It's got around 600,000 views. And in this video, there is an argument that is made that the Qur'an is divine based on certain linguistic characteristics that it has. Basically, it's giving us certain linguistic markers in the Qur'an which prove that it must be from God. And so as a linguist myself and as a Christian, I'm really interested to see what kind of arguments are being offered here and what kind of responses can Christians make. So let's look at this together. Why don't you come along with me, and I hope you enjoy.
These were two verses from the chapter of Creation, or Surat Al-Khalq, which was written by someone who apparently accepted the challenge of the Qur'an to produce a surah like it. And apparently he did. So does that now mean that the Qur'an is not miraculous anymore? Well, certainly not. Far from it, actually.
So this video begins with a discussion of a fake surah of the Qur'an that was written by someone anonymously. This fake surah, or these really it's two ayah, it's two verses that were written. It's like about the way the world turns around the sun instead of the sun revolving around the earth. But the reason this was written is because in Surah chapter 2 verse 23, there is a challenge in the Qur'an where the Qur'an says, or Allah says, if any of you doubt that this Qur'an is revealed to our servant, the Prophet, then produce a surah like it, produce a chapter like it, basically challenging anyone who doubts the Qur'an's divinity to make a surah like one of the surahs in the Qur'an. And so someone took that challenge up and attempted to make at least two ayat that were similar to the Qur'an. Now, this whole video is going to be a response to that, so let's dive right in and get started.
Therefore, it is important to understand that the linguistic miracle of the Qur'an runs far, far deeper than just the beauty of its words and the accuracy of its expression. There are objective criteria that make even producing one short surah to be absolutely impossible.
Okay, so something I appreciate right at the top about this video is that it acknowledges that the beauty of the Quran is not good evidence for its divinity. There's lots of beautiful things in the world, lots of beautiful literature that's been written, and it's not divine. We don't consider it divine just because it's beautiful. And also beauty is so subjective, right? One person's beautiful literature can be another person's ugly literature. So it's just not a good enough criterion in order to understand if the Quran is divine or not. So I appreciate that they admit that.
Let's first start with a simple example, just to point out the premise before we explain it. And the purpose of this example is not to compare, just to illustrate the idea. William Shakespeare said, "To be or not to be, that is the question." He also said, "All that glitters is not gold." If I then come and say, "To eat or not to eat, that is the question," and then I said, "All that glitters is not diamond, it could be glass," does that now make me as good as Shakespeare, as a playwright? It would be silly to think so. Just because I took this eloquent quote from Shakespeare and then changed some words around a little bit and then added some stuff here and there, doesn't mean that now I made a quote that is as good. It only makes me look stupid. But what was originally unique and noteworthy about the work of Shakespeare at the time is that he thought of a unique way to deliver a certain message. Simple words full of meaning. That's why some of the quotes are still alive today. So, to be as good, I need to think of a unique quote that is influential enough to be remembered years from today. Not just to imitate some of what he said and play with words around a little bit and then claim victory. That is just a very shallow way of thinking.
Okay, that is very interesting. So, Arabic 101, right at the beginning here, has actually changed the goalposts or changed the definition for success. Remember, the challenge from the Qur'an is to produce a surah like the Qur'an. But what Arabic 101 does here is he says, if I copy William Shakespeare's one of his phrases, like all that glitters is not gold, but I change it slightly, does that make me as good of a playwright as William Shakespeare? No, it doesn't. But that's not what the challenge is. The challenge from the Quran is not to say, I challenge anyone to write the Quran in order to show that they are a better writer than the author of the Quran. We're not comparing who's the better author here. We're comparing the text. So the question isn't, am I a better playwright than William Shakespeare if I write this adapted phrase that from William Shakespeare's writing? The question is that new phrase that I've written similar to William Shakespeare? That's the challenge. The challenge is not, right? The challenge is not based on the author. It's based on the text. And so right from the beginning here, he's changing the goalposts and he's saying, well, because this fabricated surah from the Quran, or that's not from the Quran, this fabricated surah is not as original as the Quran. Therefore, it's not like the Quran. But remember, the challenge is to imitate the Quran or to write something that's like it. So by definition, it's not going to be original. How could it be original? It's supposed to imitate it. So you're doing a heads I win, tails you lose maneuver here by saying, well, the Quran is original. Therefore, anyone who tries to imitate the Quran is not going to be original. But if someone did do something original, then it wouldn't be like the Quran anymore, because the point is to imitate the Quran. So which is it? Are we writing something that's like the Quran, or are we writing something original? This is interesting. He's already kind of lost sight of the challenge, and I think it shows that the challenge from the Quran is suspect, to say the least.
First, the Qur'an, a new system. Before the Qur'an was revealed, Arabs had poetry and prose. There was no other form of literature. But when the Qur'an was revealed, there was poetry, prose, and the Qur'an. In fact, the Qur'an was so revolutionary and groundbreaking as literature that it didn't belong to either poetry or prose. It was a whole new system that even had its own jargon, which are unique words that specially belong to the Qur'an. The word Qur'an itself, the word surah, ayah, tilawa, or tala, and all this kind of words that uniquely belong to the Qur'an. Interestingly, none of these words was promptly defined at the beginning of the book, as you would expect from a new book, to tell us what Qur'an is and what is an ayah, a surah. But for some reason, that was never needed in the case of the Qur'an. Arabs just understood what each of these words meant, and it fit perfectly in what the Qur'an was all about.
Okay, I think by new system, Arabic 101 is referring to new genre, because poetry and prose are genres of literature. And that is definitely something that other Muslims will say, that the Quran is a unique genre. This is actually a huge problem for the Quran, because you can't understand any literature without understanding the genre. And that's just common sense. Every person who knows how to read knows this, that there's a great difference in reading what's on the back of your cereal box versus what you're reading. If you're reading a comic book or if you are reading a science textbook, you are going to weigh the information differently, and you're going to understand what's being communicated very differently. And so the fact that the Quran is neither poetry nor prose, but is its own genre, is a big issue. Another issue is that the Quran clearly has genres within it. Let's look at a couple of these. So in Surah 20, ayah 14, Allah says, I am God. There is no other God beside me. You shall worship me alone and observe Salah in order to remember me. Now this is what's known as hortatory literature. That is to say that it is a command from God to people. And in this case, it's religious hortatory literature. It's literature that is giving them commands about religious worship practice. So that is a genre. That in order to understand that command, you already have to identify that this is hortatory literature, that this is a command from God. If you can't do that, then you aren't going to be able to say, "Oh, I should only worship God and no other gods." If you can't identify the genre first, you can't know that. Let's look at another example. Surah 9, verse 5. "And when the forbidden months have passed, kill the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them prisoners, and beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them at every place of ambush." Okay, just like the previous verse, this is a command. Are Muslims arguing that they should take this command seriously and start killing unbelievers? Well, if you're not going to do that, you're going to have to base it in the context of the passage, which is another way of saying the genre of the passage, right? You have to say, oh, well, the previous passage about worshiping only God, that's religious hortatory genre, whereas this is historical hortatory genre. This is a historically significant battle that was being fought, and this is a command only for that time in the past, but not for the present day. In order to distinguish those two verses, you need to distinguish their genre. That's the only way you can do that. If you don't distinguish their genre, then you're just picking and choosing randomly what you like and what you don't like. And that's not systematic, and that's not using our brains, right? That's just taking what we like from God's word, and we don't want to be doing that, right? If this is truly God's word, we need to have a system for understanding it, and so you need to understand the genre.
Second, a new branch of knowledge. The Quran came with a brand new branch of knowledge, tajweed. Tajweed is the way we should read the Quran. It is true that some aspects of tajweed were indeed part of how Arabs talked, like heavy, light letters, qalqala, iqlab. But Arabs didn't elongate words, which is using med. They didn't extend the ghunna of noon in certain situations. They didn't apply ikhfa, as we would do when reading the Quran. These are just some of the unique features of the Quran that are applied on the Quran when read. And these rules have been passed down from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, till this very day. So the second question now is, that surah you're thinking about making to look like the Quran, remember to also devise a new system with which you can read your surah, and it has to be a unique branch of knowledge.
Okay, he says now that the second piece of evidence is that the Quran comes with a new branch of knowledge. Now, again, this is a very generous title for what tajweed is. Tajweed just is talking about the rules of recitation of the Quran. That there's certain, when you are speaking the Quran, there are certain ways that you're reading certain words, places you pause, letters you skip over, letters you double, all sorts of very intricate rules for reciting the Quran. And he says this is a new branch of knowledge. I think that's not true. A new branch of knowledge is like discovering science or something like that. Tajweed is not a branch of knowledge. Tajweed is specific rules for reciting the Quran. And he says these were passed down from the Prophet Muhammad. Again, as a literary genius who comes up with the Quran, I see no reason why he couldn't have laid out rules for reciting the Quran. There's nothing that's particularly difficult about that. I mean, Arabic 101 says, remember in your fake surah that you're producing to come up with new tajweed. And I say, okay, that would be pretty easy to do. You just have to, I could just think of a million things. You could recite the entire thing in falsetto. You could basically, you could read it at double speed. You could skip every nun if you wanted. Like, there's a million different rules you could just make up for recitation, and you might say, well, those are frivolous, those are silly. And then I would go back to the earlier question of like, well, is this supposed to be an imitation of the Quran or is it supposed to be original? Because if it's going to be original, it's going to sound weird to people for the first time, right? Like I'm sure the first person who did tajweed of the Quran sounded weird to people. They're like, oh, that's not how we normally read. So just remember that tajweed is not actually going to be a very difficult thing to produce. And calling it a separate branch of knowledge and therefore saying that it must be divine because it comes with certain rules for recitation is a huge stretch. That's also taking into context the fact that Jews already had a Jewish form of tajweed. Obviously, they didn't call it tajweed, but rules for reciting the Torah. There are lots of rules. So there are other Abrahamic faiths that already had rules for reciting their holy book. So it wasn't even a unique thing for the Quran or for Muslims to have rules to recite the Quran. This is a common thing that existed in the Middle East long before Muhammad, long before the Quran. And so there's nothing divine about tajweed.
The first type. Words like sultan, marad, ينظرون, أسلم, تولى, قم, الأجر, الإحسان, القيامة, النار, and hundreds of other words. Arabs knew all of these words, but in the Qur'an, they were used in such a way that gave them a new dimension and a new meaning. But the most surprising part in all of that is that when they were used like that, Arabs were able to understand exactly what they meant. Take the word marad as an example. Arabs knew what this word meant, sickness, but when it was used as في قلوبهم مرض, it was easy for them to realize that this was not a real sickness, a physical one. Sickness of the heart is doubt and affectation. And yet, when it was used in this context, it made perfect sense, and they directly understood what exactly it meant, without having to explain it or define what it means.
Okay, so the argument here is that there are certain words in the Quran that previously meant one thing, but then in the Quran they mean something else, something slightly different. For example, marad used to mean sickness, and then in the phrase fi qulubihim marad, in their hearts sickness, we can see in that case it means like being sick in the heart, like being doubtful or something. And these words changed their meaning, but what was incredible or what's claimed to be miraculous about this is that the meaning shifted slightly, but no one who read it needed like a full dictionary explanation to understand what was going on. The problem with this argument is that it totally is ignorant of how language and words really change over time. When you dive into historical linguistics, you see that this type of change of slight changes over time, for marad, for example, changing from sickness, although it still means that, but marad changing only from sickness to also meaning like heart sickness or doubt, that is a very small lexical change actually. And that is the kind of thing that is happening all the time in every language around the whole world, always. There's no time at which language is static. There's no time at which a word is not changing meanings. Meanings are constantly changing because people are using language in different ways. But what's interesting is that when meaning changes, people don't need an explanation to understand what this new meaning is. That is totally gleaned from the context that it's being used in. And so when you have new words that you're learning. I mean, this is how kids learn language, right? Kids learn language. You don't sit down with a dictionary to teach a 2-year-old how to speak. You just talk, and they learn all the new words via context and via facial expressions and tone of voice and other paratextual clues like hand emotions, for example. And so it's really important to remember the Quran was not originally a book. It was recited. And so this is especially true in recitation, where if someone's reciting something to you, they have a lot more extra linguistic clues like facial expressions, tone of voice, for example, to help you understand new words. So when Muhammad, say, is reciting the Quran and says, fi qulubihim marad, that the people who are listening are not just getting the words, they're getting the whole context of the recitation. And so that will make it even easier for people to understand how this word has been changed. So the fact that there are some words in the Qur'an, like sultan or marad, that have changed their meaning slightly in the Qur'an, that's totally, there's nothing divine about that. There's nothing miraculous about that. That is a very normal process that all languages undergo all the time. And so this is really not any evidence that the Qur'an is divine.
What about the second type? New words that were derived from Arabic roots. While these words did come from Arabic roots, the form of such words was still new to Arabs. But just like the previous type, these words didn't need any exposition or explanation. So for example, Arabs knew yura'i, but they didn't know ri'a. They knew ittaqa, but not at-taqwa. Ash-shukr was known to them, but not ash-shukur. They knew al-alam, but they never thought of using it in plural, al-alamin. So while anyone can come up with new words, the true miracle here is combining novelty and unambiguity. And not just once, but throughout the entire book. And readers were still able to understand the perfectly conveyed message. And if you're finding it difficult to understand how can something so new be so clear, that is exactly why it is called a miracle, and one of many reasons why it can't be replicated.
Well, no, I'm not in any way struggling to see how something so new could be so clear. That is how all language works. So in this argument that he's saying is slightly different than the previous argument. Here he's saying there are words that were new words, but the form was different. And so how were Arabs able to understand this? Again, this is nothing special. This is exactly how language changes. In all these cases, we have regular changes that are being applied to words that the meaning is very clear because the change is predictable. For example, William Shakespeare introduced up to, some people say, 1,700 words, new words, into the English lexicon through his plays. And so, like, that's, for example, why I don't find it convincing that Muhammad had to be divinely inspired. If William Shakespeare can introduce thousands of new words, there's no reason why Muhammad or anyone else couldn't introduce new Arabic words. So there's nothing special going on there. Now, we can see how this doesn't really work as a miracle when we look at the Shakespearean examples. So, for example, William Shakespeare introduced words like bedroom, upstairs, fashionable, or inaudible. And all these words are words that had never been used in that way before, but they were composed of other English words and were being arranged in a new way, right? For example, bedroom, bed plus room. Okay, even if you'd never heard the word bedroom, but you were a native English speaker and you heard the word bedroom, that's going to be very clear and obvious to you, right? Because the meaning of the two words is put together, it's pretty clear. There's nothing miraculous about that. The same thing with a word like upstairs. I'm going to go upstairs. Even if you've never heard the word upstairs before, up plus stairs, okay, logically you can see what this word means. So this is a very normal process that languages undergo where words are combined or changed slightly to give a new meaning. This happens today in English all the time. We have words like hellscape or rage quit or mansplain or fat shame, right? Those are all words that are composed of smaller words. And you even if you've never heard the word rage quit before, you can understand what it means. Rage quit, right? Just to basically get angry and quit. And so by Arabic 101 saying, well, the Qur'an is full of words that have changed their form slightly and then still been able to be understood, that must be divine. That's ridiculous. That's a normal process that happens every single day. And so, again, there's no reason to think the Qur'an is divine just based on the changing of words in this way.
The Qur'an didn't only come with new words, but also new ways to say things and express them. And again, clarity perfectly combined with originality. Take, for example, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Arabs knew both words, but using them in this way, in this combination, that was never done before. Maliki Yawmiddin. The word Malik is owner, and Yawm means day. Arabs never used this combination in this way. How can you own a day, a piece of time? And yet, in its context, it made perfect sense what this was referring to. And every single surah contains a combination of all of these. Yet, the result is clear, concise, and beautiful, all at the same time.
Okay, now this third argument is saying that the Quran is full of new expressions or ways of combining words together in a phrase. And again, this was clearly understood by the readers. So therefore, how is that possible? It must be a miracle. Once again, don't want to keep repeating myself, but this is a normal linguistic process. In fact, this is the least convincing of all the arguments here. Making up new phrases, new metaphors is something that goes on all the time. And actually, recent linguistic research into metaphor comprehension has shown that people understand metaphors quite well most of the time with no explanation, actually. Most people are able to understand a metaphor pretty much entirely on the first try with no explanation. And so, again, we can see this through William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare introduced many new expressions. For example, pure as the driven snow. Right? Pure as the driven snow. Okay, that's an expression. No one, even if you've never heard that expression before, you don't need any explanation. It's very obvious, right? Snow is white. Being pure is to be like white, and so you're pure as the snow that's not even landed on the ground yet. And so it's the expression is clear and obvious. You don't need any special knowledge to know that. And just like this in the Quranic example, Maliki Yawmiddin. Okay, the master of the day of judgment. That's not difficult to understand at all. That's very clear. All the words are well known, and the fact that they've been combined in a certain way in no way makes it difficult to understand. And you can see this by if you're speaking to somebody, inevitably every now and then you're going to hear combinations of words that you'd never heard before. But that doesn't mean you don't understand them, right? I could say, something like, angry platypus. Maybe you've never heard those combinations of words before, but is that an idea that's totally incomprehensible to you? Probably not. You probably understand angry platypus just fine. And so again, this is just a totally glossing over how language actually works, how people actually talk, how expressions are actually formed. None of this is divine. None of this is unique to the Quran. This is regular boilerplate stuff for all languages around the world. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the video. To be honest, I'm a little disappointed. None of those linguistic arguments were any good. They are all just basically saying that the Quran must be miraculous, but then the reasoning is that the Quran underwent basic linguistic changes that every work of literature goes through and every language experiences. So there's absolutely nothing divine about any of the arguments being argued here. So before we conclude, though, I would like to address one important issue. So here's a question. Why do I, as a Christian, believe that the Bible is divinely inspired? Well, I don't believe the Bible is divinely inspired because it's beautiful, though there are many parts of the Bible that are beautiful. I don't believe that it's inspired because of linguistic features that make it unique or impossible to imitate. The reason I believe the Bible is inspired is because the message it communicates is true. And that's the most important element of the Bible. The Bible is important not because of its form, not because of the way it was written or the language that it used. What's important about the Bible is what is the message being communicated. And so the same thing is true with the Quran. The message of the Quran is much more important than the form that it was revealed in. And there's no way to really discuss form because people have different preferences, right? I might like the form of the Hebrew scriptures more than the Quran, for example. Well, does that mean the Hebrew scriptures are more obviously inspired? No. The question is, which message is the true message? And so when Christians and Muslims are engaging in dialogue about the Qur'an versus the Bible, I think we need to leave aside these very weak linguistic arguments about the Quran being inspired or the Bible being inspired. And instead, we need to focus on the important element of which holy book is true, which one is communicating God's real message. And when we do that, that will help us to dive deeper into history and will put us on a footing that will allow us to have a productive dialogue instead of just arguing about what type of literature we happen to prefer. So, I hope this video has been helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave a comment below. I'd love to interact with you. And I hope you have a great day. May peace and blessings be upon you and your family.